I'd been a deputy in rural Louisiana long enough to know how eerie the deep woods could get at night. It wasn't just the thick, suffocating silence that could make your skin crawl. It was the way the forest seemed to come alive in the dark. The brush, the trees. Hell, even the ground seemed to shift in ways that weren't natural. But that night, I didn't think much of it. It was just another shift on the graveyard patrol. I'd gotten a call about a broken-down truck, nothing too serious. A guy, probably in his mid-30s, said his engine had conked out on some old dirt road about 15 miles from town. I was familiar with the area. Just a long stretch of nothing. Fields, trees, the occasional shack where the poorer folks lived. I didn't expect anything weird. It was a quiet part of the county. When I reached the spot, the truck was parked off the side of the road, the engine hood up, and the man standing beside it. He had this wild look in his eyes, like he'd been out there longer than he should have been. "Need a hand?" I asked, getting out of the patrol car. My flashlight cut through the night, lighting up his tired face. He wiped his forehead with the back of his hand and looked at me with a forced smile. "Yeah, I think I'm stuck," he said, his voice a bit shaky. "I've been trying to get this thing started for hours, but no luck." I walked up to the truck and peered under the hood. It looked fine, no signs of damage, no wires disconnected. But the engine wasn't even trying to turn over. I leaned in closer, trying to listen for any odd sounds, but everything was dead quiet. "You got a cell phone?" I asked. "I can call a tow truck for you." The man glanced around, almost nervously, before reaching into his pocket and pulling out an old, cracked phone. He turned it over in his hands, almost like he was debating whether or not to use it. "I don't think I can get any signal out here," he mumbled, and I could see that his hands were trembling. "I'm not from around here." That caught my attention. "Where are you from, then?" "Up north," he said quickly, a little too quickly. "Just passing through. Got lost in these damn woods." He gestured to the thick trees surrounding us, as though he expected something to jump out at any moment. It was weird. The guy didn't seem like he was from anywhere in Louisiana, but the way he spoke, there was a certain kind of southern unease in his tone that made me wonder if he was hiding something. "All right. Well, I can try calling it in for you," I said. "But we'll need to figure out what's going on with this engine first. It doesn't seem like anything serious." I took another look at the truck, tapping the side of the engine with my flashlight. That's when I heard it. A rhythmic sound, like something drumming against a tree, faint but there. At first, I thought it was just the wind or maybe an animal, but it wasn't natural. It was too consistent, almost deliberate. I glanced over at the man, who was now looking around the woods nervously. "You hear that?" I asked, my voice low. He stiffened, then nodded slowly. "Yeah, I heard it. Thought it was just me being out here too long." I didn't buy it. The sound didn't sit right with me. It wasn't the usual noise the woods made. I took a step toward the trees, my flashlight cutting through the dark brush. "Stay here," I told the guy, motioning for him to stay put. He didn't protest, but I could tell he was uneasy, maybe more than he let on. I walked toward the sound, scanning the area. The trees were thick, the brush dense. The air felt heavy, like something was watching. I couldn't explain it, but the atmosphere shifted when I stepped away from the truck. The drumming sound got louder, more insistent. My flashlight flickered, and I snapped it back to life, my heartbeat picking up a little. The closer I got, the more I realized it wasn't just the wind or an animal. Someone, or something, was out there, moving deliberately. I stopped dead in my tracks when I saw it. In the distance, barely visible through the trees, was what looked like a figure, a person, maybe. They were standing still, just barely lit by the dim glow of my flashlight. I couldn't make out their face, but the outline was unmistakable. The way they stood motionless, almost too still, gave me chills. I took a step closer, instinctively reaching for my gun. But before I could draw, the figure vanished into the thick woods as quickly as it had appeared. My breath caught in my throat, and I turned back toward the truck, my eyes darting to the man, who was now visibly sweating and shaking. "You all right?" I asked, trying to sound calm, though my heart was racing. The guy didn't respond right away. He just stared out into the woods, his eyes wide with panic. Finally, he whispered, "It's happening again." "Again? What the hell are you talking about?" I was starting to lose patience, but something in his voice made me pause. He looked at me, his face pale, and for the first time, I saw real fear in his eyes. "The drumming," he said, almost pleading. "I've been hearing it for days. It's always the same, and it always comes from those woods. I thought if I left, it'd stop, but it's not stopping. I didn't know what to think. The guy was either losing his mind, or there was something more to this. I didn't want to admit it, but the drumming, the way he acted, it didn't add up. Something was wrong. Something I couldn't explain. I turned back to the woods, scanning the darkness. No sign of the figure, but the air felt thick with tension. A low hum filled the silence, almost like a warning. I grabbed the man by the arm. "Get in the truck," I said, my voice firm. "We're leaving." He didn't resist, but as we got in, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed in the woods, like we weren't alone anymore. The night seemed heavier, the drumming louder in my head. I started the truck and drove back toward the main road, but I couldn't ignore the sinking feeling in my stomach. The guy stayed quiet the whole time, his eyes never leaving the woods as we passed. When I glanced in the rearview mirror, the brush was still, as if nothing had happened. I didn't know what he meant by it happening again, but I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't going back into those woods alone again. There was something out there, something that didn't want to be found. I'd been in this line of work too long not to trust my instincts, and my gut told me that whatever was out there, whatever had been stalking him, was still out there, waiting. I've been a sheriff in Grits Creek for close to 20 years. It's the kind of place most people don't remember. The kind of town you blink through on your way to somewhere else. You've got your small group of lifelong residents, your few newcomers, and then there's the outskirts, places no one really talks about. It's not that there's much danger around here. The crime rate is almost laughable. But then, there are those calls that make you wonder. This one was no different. A woman named Rita Davenport called me one night around 3 a.m. I remember it well because the phone call itself was unsettling from the start. Her voice sounded off, distant and trembling, even though there wasn't a sign of panic. She reported hearing strange knocks on her door. Not just any knocks, specific, deliberate knocks that sounded like someone was trying to get her attention. And it wasn't just once, it was every night at exactly 3 a.m. Now, you get all kinds of reports when you work in a small town. The occasional drunk looking for trouble, the occasional loud argument between neighbors. But something about Rita's voice felt different. Like she wasn't just scared of someone knocking on her door. It was deeper than that. She sounded almost numb. "Sheriff," she said, "it's been every night this week. I just can't take it anymore. I'm afraid to open the door. I'm afraid to not open it." I figured it was a prank, maybe even a neighbor pulling a twisted joke, but something in her tone kept me from dismissing her out of hand. I told her I'd come by and take a look. I've known Rita for years. She's a quiet woman, works at the local diner, lives alone in a small house on the edge of town. Her house is one of the older ones, sitting on a stretch of road that leads into the woods. The place always had a worn, forgotten feel to it, but Rita's one of those people who doesn't ask for attention. She's the kind of person you see in town, working hard, keeping to herself. When I pulled up to her house that night, the porch light was on, casting a dim glow across the yard. It was a stark contrast to the surrounding blackness of the woods behind her house. The night felt heavier than usual, the kind of oppressive air that sits like a weight on your chest. I knocked on the door, and Rita opened it almost immediately, her face pale, her hair disheveled as if she hadn't slept in days. "Come in," she said, stepping aside. I followed her inside, noticing the faint smell of something old, stagnant. She led me into the living room, where she had a small lamp lit. The room was too quiet, almost suffocatingly so. I asked her to sit down, but she didn't. She just stood by the door, her eyes scanning the empty space like she was listening for something. "What exactly have you been hearing?" I asked. She was silent for a long moment, as if she was deciding whether to answer. Finally, she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "At first, it was just knocks," she said, "but then it started getting more. Like a rhythm. And sometimes, it sounds like someone's dragging something. It happens at exactly 3 a.m. every night." I raised an eyebrow. I wasn't sure if I believed her, but the look in her eyes made me hesitate. "Do you have any idea who could be doing this?" I asked. "Could be someone just messing with you." She shook her head slowly. "No. I've been living here for almost 20 years, and no one's ever bothered me like this. But the knocks, they don't stop. They don't even sound like they're from the door." I frowned. "What do you mean?" "It sounds like the knocks are coming from inside the house. Like someone's tapping on the walls. But it's always just outside the door when I go to look." I walked over to the door, which was slightly ajar, and stood in front of it, listening. The house was eerily still. The only sound was the distant hum of insects from outside. I waited, trying to shake off the feeling that I was being watched. "You hear it now?" she asked, her voice tight with anxiety. I paused, focusing on the silence. Nothing. But I couldn't shake the feeling. Something was off about the house, the air, the way the shadows seemed to move in the corners of the room. "I'm not hearing anything," I said, turning back to her. "But we'll figure this out, Rita. Maybe it's just an animal or something that's gotten in." She shook her head again, her eyes wide with fear. "No, Sheriff. It's not an animal. It's someone. And I think they've been here before. They know me." A chill ran down my spine at the last part. I glanced around the room, my eyes landing on the small hallway that led deeper into the house. I had been here before, many times. It was always quiet, normal. But now, standing in the middle of her living room, everything felt wrong. I started to walk toward the hallway, but Rita stopped me. "Sheriff, please," she pleaded. "Don't go back there. I hear them there too. They don't want anyone to see them. They hide." I turned to her, my patience starting to wear thin. "Rita, you need to relax. I'm not going to let anything happen to you, but you've got to help me figure out what's really going on." I could tell she wanted to say something else, but she just nodded, her lips pressed tight together. She led me down the hallway to the back of the house, where the rooms were dark, only lit by the low glow of my flashlight. When we reached the final room, Rita stopped and pointed to the far corner. I shone the light in the direction she was pointing, but there was nothing there. The room looked as it always had. Furniture, a few family pictures hanging on the walls, a rocking chair by the window. But something felt wrong. I walked closer to the corner, shining my flashlight into the shadows. That's when I saw it. It was subtle at first, a faint outline, like a shape in the corner of the room that didn't belong. I took a step closer, and that's when I realized what it was, a figure, hunched over, half hidden by the dark. It wasn't just a shadow, it was alive. Before I could react, Rita let out a strangled scream. The figure in the corner seemed to move, shifting in the dim light, and before I could even draw my weapon, it was gone, vanished into thin air, as if it had never been there. I whipped around to face Rita, but she was gone. The door to the room was wide open, and the sound of hurried footsteps echoed through the house, followed by silence. I rushed out into the hallway, but there was no sign of her. The house was empty. I stayed there for hours, combing through every room, searching for any sign of Rita, but I couldn't find her. And when I finally left the house, the only thing I could hear was the sound of my own heartbeat, echoing in the stillness of the night. The next morning, Rita was gone. The house was empty, like no one had ever lived there. No one saw her leave. No one knew where she went. I didn't report it. There was no reason to. There was no proof that anything had happened. But I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever had been in that house was still watching, waiting. And maybe, just maybe, it would come back for me one day. I've been a deputy for over 14 years, and there are moments in a lawman's career where you start to realize that things aren't as simple as they seem. That's what happened to me a few months ago when I got called to investigate a piece of land that no one in our small Louisiana parish had ever paid much attention to, a long-abandoned church on the outskirts of town. It had always been a place for the local kids to explore or to prank each other, and that was pretty much the extent of the rumors, until one day, a strange, out-of-towner bought it. It wasn't the purchase itself that caught my attention. It was the fact that, for the first time in years, the building was getting attention from people outside our parish. Word started to spread that something was being done to the place. Now, normally, when new people move in, it's just a matter of getting to know them, maybe giving them a friendly warning about the local wildlife or how to handle the heat. But something felt off about this one. The man who'd bought the place, Jared McAllister, didn't have much of a background in the area. The people who had lived in the parish for generations, like me, we tended to know each other. Jared wasn't from here, though, and that's when the whispers started. The whispers always follow newcomers in small towns, but this was different. The people who knew Jared said he was strange. Quiet, reclusive, kept mostly to himself, but there was something else. Something unnatural about it. I didn't buy it at first, but as the days went on, I started to feel uneasy myself. It wasn't until I received that call from one of the parish's old-timers that I realized how wrong I had been. It was old Bart Wilkins, a man who used to serve as deputy before my time. He had a reputation for being level-headed, even in the face of things most people would run from. But when Bart called me late one night, his voice was shaking. "Deputy Marshal, you've got to get to that church," he said. "Something's happening there, and it's not right." I'd heard enough to know that Bart wasn't one to exaggerate. So, I grabbed my gear and made my way out to the church just after midnight. The air was thick with humidity, and a fog had started to roll in from the bayou. The church sat on a plot of land that had been overgrown with trees and brush. The old, weathered building seemed to sink into the land, as though it had been forgotten for decades. But not anymore. When I arrived, the only thing I could hear was the distant croak of frogs and the rustling of leaves in the breeze. The church itself looked as eerie as I remembered: cracked stained glass windows, broken stone steps leading up to the porch, and the faded sign that read St. Dimphna's Church. It looked like something straight out of a ghost story, but I didn't believe in ghosts. Not yet. I walked around the back of the church, trying to make sense of what Bart had said. He hadn't been specific about what he thought was happening, but I knew it had something to do with Jared McAllister. I noticed the light in the upstairs window flickering, and that's when I saw something strange. A shadow moving in the second-story window. At first, I thought it was just the wind, but there was something wrong with the way it moved, too fluid, too deliberate. I took a few cautious steps toward the door when I heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps behind me. I spun around, hand on my sidearm, but there was no one there. Just the fog creeping in, making everything look even more surreal. Then the door creaked open, just a little. No one had come out. It felt like something was waiting for me. I pushed the door open, my flashlight cutting through the darkness inside. The smell of mildew and old wood hit me immediately. The air was thick and heavy with age. The pews inside were covered in dust, the floors warped from years of neglect. But there was something more, something I couldn't put my finger on. A sense of wrongness, like this place had been untouched for a reason. The light flickered again, coming from a small room in the back. I moved toward it, every step making the floorboards groan under my weight. I reached the doorway and stopped. Inside, Jared McAllister stood in front of a wooden altar, his back to me. But it wasn't just Jared I was looking at. The room was filled with strange symbols, runes, carved into the walls and floors, barely visible under the dust and cobwebs. They didn't make sense. Some were Latin, others I couldn't even begin to identify. And the altar? It wasn't the simple thing you'd expect in an old church. It was covered in dirt and dried leaves, and there was something alive about it. Jared turned slowly, his eyes wide with a kind of intensity I'd never seen before. There was no warmth in his gaze. It was all sharp edges, like he was seeing something I couldn't. "You shouldn't be here," he said, his voice calm but almost hypnotic. "They're watching." "Who is?" I asked, stepping into the room, hands still on my holster. "The ones who came before," he said, his gaze drifting upward, as if he was speaking to someone or something else in the room. His tone was distant, like he wasn't fully present in his own body. Then, without warning, the air in the room grew colder, a chill that seeped into my bones. The shadows seemed to stretch, darkening the corners of the church, and I felt the unmistakable weight of eyes on me. Jared took a step toward me, his face growing more intense. "They've been waiting for you, Leon. You just didn't know it yet." My instincts kicked in. I pulled out my flashlight and turned it on him, but as I did, something shifted. It was subtle at first, a flicker in the light, a change in the air. But the altar, it seemed to move. The floor groaned, and the symbols on the walls seemed to glow for a brief moment. That's when I knew. I wasn't dealing with a man who had bought an old church to restore it. I wasn't dealing with someone who just wanted to be left alone. I was dealing with something far worse, a man who had stumbled into something ancient and terrifying. And now, I was caught in it. I grabbed Jared's arm, pulling him away from the altar. But he resisted, his strength surprising me. "You don't understand," he muttered. "You're already part of it. They've been waiting for this." The room shook, the floorboards creaking under the pressure of something unseen. I pulled Jared toward the door, but the shadows followed, creeping closer, as though they were alive, closing in on us. With a final, desperate shove, I got him out of the room, slamming the door behind us. As we ran, I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't escaping, that whatever had been waiting for us had already set its mark. Jared's words echoed in my head, and I realized, too late, that the town of Grits Creek, my town, had been hiding something darker than I could ever imagine. And now, I was in it too. I've been sheriff of Cold Harbor, Alabama, for the better part of 5 years now, and in all that time, nothing ever truly rattled me. Small town life is quiet. Most days, I handled the usual: lost dogs, neighbor disputes, the occasional traffic stop. Nothing to get worked up over. But then, the disappearances started. It wasn't just one or two people going missing. This was a pattern, and it was happening at an alarmingly consistent rate. The first was Hank Voss, a quiet guy who ran the local gas station. He'd been a fixture in town for as long as I could remember, sitting outside his shop every morning at 6 a.m., sipping coffee, talking to anyone who stopped by. One morning, though, Hank didn't show up. People thought he was just sick or maybe went out of town. But as days passed, then weeks, no one heard from him. No one saw him. And his family, normally very close-knit, didn't seem concerned. It was strange, but we all thought maybe Hank had just decided to disappear. It happens. Then it started happening more. There was Lila, the new girl who worked at the diner. She'd only been in town for a few weeks before she vanished without a trace. No one knew where she went, and her parents didn't file a report. No one questioned it, not at first. A fisherman named Greg Palmer had come through the town, stopping by for a drink at the bar. He was here for a day or two, then gone. Same story. Another tourist, another disappearance. Each one was a little stranger than the last, but still, no one really seemed to care, at least, no one except me. Something about it didn't sit right. It wasn't just random folks disappearing. It was people who had been here a while, people who were part of the town's fabric. And yet, no one seemed to want to talk about it. I remember the day it all changed. It was around midnight when I got a call from Roger Finley. He'd retired years ago, back when I was just a kid, but I knew him well enough. Roger had always been the steady hand in Cold Harbor, the kind of guy who could take the worst of what the town had to offer and not bat an eye. But when I picked up the phone that night, his voice was unsteady. "Kayla," he said, breathing heavily, "you need to stop looking into it." I felt a cold shiver run down my spine. "Stop looking into what, Roger?" "The disappearances," he whispered. "It's not what you think. There's more to it. Worse things have happened here. Things no one wants to remember. You don't know what you're dealing with." I didn't know what to make of it. Roger had always been the kind of guy who kept things to himself, especially when it came to the old days. But his tone? That was something new. It was fear I was hearing in his voice. "Roger, what do you mean?" I asked, my heart beating faster now. "You've got to understand," he said, his voice barely audible. "Cold Harbor isn't what you think it is. It's built on blood. And if you keep digging, they'll come for you too." I tried to calm him down, but he wouldn't say another word. The line went dead. The next morning, I drove out to the local hospital to check on him. When I got there, they told me he'd disappeared during the night. No one saw him leave, no signs of a struggle. He was just gone. That's when I realized there was something more going on here, something I had missed, something I didn't want to believe. I spent the next few days digging into Cold Harbor's past, but no one wanted to talk about it. I visited the old-timers, the ones who had lived here their entire lives. They clammed up whenever I mentioned the disappearances. It was like they were afraid to say anything. One night, I found an old map of the town in the archives, one that dated back to the early 1800s. It was a hand-drawn map, faded with age, showing Cold Harbor as it was in its infancy. At the center of the map, there was a strange symbol, something I didn't recognize, but it had been marked with a thick red circle. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was getting closer to something that had been buried for far too long. That symbol, why hadn't I ever seen it before? I drove out to the area marked on the map, a piece of land near the river. The fog had rolled in that night, thick and suffocating. The town streets were quiet, too quiet. As I parked my car near the woods, I got out and started walking, my flashlight cutting through the mist. The deeper I went, the more the air seemed to thicken, pressing in on me like something wasn't right. Eventually, I reached a clearing, and that's when I saw it. An old stone marker, weathered by time, sitting in the middle of the woods. It was partially covered by moss, but the symbol, the same symbol from the map, was clearly etched into the surface. I felt my stomach twist. This was no coincidence. But as I stood there, trying to process what I was seeing, I heard a noise behind me. It was a low, rumbling sound, almost like chanting, but it wasn't human. My heart raced in my chest as I spun around, scanning the dark shadows of the woods. And then I saw them. Figures, moving slowly toward me from the trees. At first, I thought it was just my mind playing tricks, but no. They were real, too real. Tall, gaunt figures with hollow eyes, their faces obscured by shadows. I froze, my body paralyzed with fear. They didn't move like people. They drifted, their feet not quite touching the ground. They spoke without words, their voices whispering in my ears, filling my head with the most terrible kind of dread. "You shouldn't have come, Sheriff," they murmured. "You've awakened what's been sleeping. Now, it's time for you to join them." I backed away, heart pounding in my chest, but the figures didn't follow. They just stood there, watching, waiting. And then, as quickly as they had appeared, they vanished into the fog. I ran back to my car as fast as I could, my mind reeling with what I had just witnessed. The next day, I found a small group of people gathered at the town square, all acting as if nothing had happened. No one seemed to notice the way the air felt heavier, or the way the woods seemed to be watching us. The disappearances, I now understood, weren't just random. They were part of something much darker, something the town had been hiding for generations. Cold Harbor wasn't just a town. It was a place built on a curse, one that had been passed down through the years, hidden beneath layers of lies and silence. I wish I could say I understood what happened that night. I wish I could tell you that I solved it, that I brought justice to those who had disappeared. But the truth is, I haven't solved anything. The town? It's still here, just as it always has been. But now I know the truth. Cold Harbor isn't what it seems. And I'll never be the same after what I saw. They're still here, waiting, watching, and they always will be. I had worked as the sheriff of Tannersville, Alabama, for almost 10 years. Most people think that a small town like ours would be calm, uneventful even. And for the most part, they're right. The worst thing that typically happens here is a bar fight or an animal complaint. But every once in a while, something happens that reminds you that small towns can hold some deep, disturbing secrets that people would rather keep buried. It started on a Tuesday morning in the middle of June. We had been experiencing some heavy rain the night before, but that wasn't unusual for Alabama in the summer. What was strange was the call I got at 7 a.m. from Deputy George Stone. He told me that a body had been found deep in the pine forest just outside of town, and it didn't look like any typical accident. I drove out there alone, something I wouldn't usually do, but George had a rough night, and I didn't want to drag him out in the mud. The rain had left the dirt road slick and the air thick with humidity. I arrived at the scene, just past a bend in the road, and found the deputies already roping off the area with yellow tape. The body was lying in a small clearing, surrounded by dense trees and wet underbrush. I squatted down beside the body, my boots sinking into the soft earth. The victim was a young man, maybe in his late 20s. His clothes were soaked from the rain, and his skin had the pale, waxy quality that told me he had been dead for a while, at least 24 hours, maybe longer. His face was contorted in a way I couldn't quite place, but his eyes, those were what got me. They were wide open, staring into the thick pine canopy above, as though he had seen something he couldn't believe before he died. The strangest part, though, was the marks on his body. Not just cuts or bruises, but symbols. Strange, almost ritualistic carvings along his arms, legs, and chest. I'd been in law enforcement long enough to know that this wasn't a random act of violence. Whoever had done this had a specific reason, and I wasn't sure if I was ready to find out what that reason was. I stood up, trying to push away the uneasy feeling creeping up my spine, and motioned for George to come over. "What do we know about him?" I asked, my voice low. George shuffled over, wiping the sweat from his brow despite the cool morning. "His name's Lucas Reed. Local boy. He worked at the mill down by the river. No real criminal record, nothing to suggest anything like this. Just a quiet guy who kept to himself." I glanced back down at Lucas. His wide-open eyes felt like they were staring straight through me, like he was trying to tell me something. "Anything strange in his life recently?" I asked, though I had a feeling I already knew the answer. George shook his head. "Nothing that anyone's noticed. But I did hear some rumors about the Reed family. They're old-timers, been around for generations. Some folks say they've got a family curse." I raised an eyebrow. A curse? I'd heard the odd gossip over the years, but that kind of talk always seemed like something people made up when they didn't understand things. Still, I couldn't help but be intrigued. I turned back to the body and scanned the clearing again. There was something familiar about this place. Not the exact spot, but the woods themselves. I'd spent most of my life in Tannersville, and the pines had always felt like home, even if they did seem a little too thick, a little too quiet at times. The trees always felt like they were watching, like they were hiding something. I took a deep breath and knelt down by Lucas's body again. The symbols carved into his skin, those weren't just random cuts. They had meaning. I needed to figure out what they meant, and to do that, I'd have to dig into the town's past. I called in for a forensics team to examine the body, then made my way back to the station. The sun had started to burn through the clouds, and the air felt stifling as I sat down at my desk. I opened up the files on the Reed family. As far back as I could trace, they had always been a part of this town. Their land was one of the first plots settled in Tannersville, and they owned a good chunk of the riverfront. But there were gaps in the records, things that didn't add up, and whispers of something darker. People had always treated the Reeds with a mixture of reverence and fear, like they knew something that others didn't. That night, I drove out to the Reed family land. The old house was still standing, though it looked like it hadn't been lived in for decades. The windows were boarded up, the porch sagging under the weight of time. It was a place I had passed 1,000 times, but had never thought much of. Tonight, though, something about it felt different. I parked the car on the side of the road and got out. The night was quiet, eerily still, and the pines stood tall around me, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch toward the house. I approached the front porch slowly, my flashlight cutting through the dark. As I reached the door, I noticed something odd. The front door was slightly ajar. My hand hovered over my gun, but I didn't draw it. I wasn't expecting trouble. I just wanted to understand what had happened to Lucas. I pushed the door open, the creaking sound almost too loud in the silence. The inside was just as abandoned as the outside. Dust covered everything, and the air smelled stale, like no one had breathed here in years. But then, I saw it, a symbol etched into the floor in the same style as the ones on Lucas's body. It was faint, but unmistakable, and it was fresh. Someone had been here recently. I crouched down, tracing the edges of the symbol with my fingers. That's when I heard it, a low sound, almost like a hum, coming from deeper in the house. It was faint, but it wasn't the wind. It was too consistent, too deliberate. My skin prickled. I stood up and walked toward the sound, my flashlight shaking in my hand. The noise led me down a narrow hallway and into a small room at the back of the house. The air in the room was cold, colder than it should have been for an Alabama summer. And in the center of the room was a stone altar, ancient-looking, covered in dust but clearly built with purpose. I stepped closer, and that's when I saw it, a pile of bones. Human bones, stacked neatly at the base of the altar, their white surface gleaming faintly in the light. Whoever had been here, whoever had been performing whatever ritual this was, had been doing it for a long time. Suddenly, I wasn't alone. I heard footsteps behind me, slow and deliberate. I turned, but no one was there. The floor creaked underfoot, as if something or someone was walking in the shadows. My heart raced, and I quickly turned to leave, but as I reached for the door, I felt a hand on my shoulder. Cold fingers gripped me tightly. "Don't leave," a voice whispered. I spun around, but there was no one there. I was alone, except for the bones, and the symbol, and the hum, growing louder, coming from deep within the walls. I ran out of the house, my heart hammering in my chest. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was following me, something ancient, something tied to this land, to the Reeds, to this town. I don't know what happened to Lucas Reed, but I do know this. Tannersville has a history, a dark history that no one talks about, that people pretend isn't there. And I think I've just uncovered the tip of the iceberg. I don't know what I'm going to do with what I've found, but I do know that I can't go back. Because whatever it is, whatever has been lying in these woods for generations, it's waking up. And now, I think it's watching me.